Every night at 7:12, the same German shepherd sat outside the old cabin door. She didn't bark, she didn't scratch, she didn't beg for food. She only waited. Inside lived a retired Navy SEAL, a man who had survived war, loss, and years of silence, but could no longer bring himself to open the door after sunset. Then, one winter night, he finally turned the handle. The German shepherd stepped inside and placed an old brass bell at his feet. Why had she been waiting for him? How did she know this door? And what secret from his late wife's past was hidden in that small, forgotten bell? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Late winter had settled over Brindle Creek, Vermont, with the tired patience of an old widow folding the same black dress for the 100th time. The snow was no longer beautiful in the way postcards promised. It had gone gray at the roadsides, heavy on the cabin roofs, and crusted along the narrow lanes where truck tires had carved frozen scars through the slush. By dusk, the pine trees behind Hemlock Ridge stood like dark witnesses, their branches bowed beneath ice, their silence deeper than any church. At the end of that ridge, where the road narrowed and gave up pretending it was meant for visitors, a small log cabin kept its windows dim and its porch light off. Inside lived Elias Ward, a retired Navy SEAL of 69, tall even in age, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that seemed carved rather than born. His silver-gray hair was cut short, his beard neatly trimmed but rough at the edges, and his pale blue eyes held the worn alertness of a man who still listened for danger, even when the only sound in the room was an old refrigerator muttering to itself. In town, people described him as polite when necessary and unreachable when possible. He did not shout. He did not complain. He simply vanished from conversations the way smoke disappears into winter air. Once, long ago, Elias had been a man who trusted maps, orders, and the clean logic of action. If a door needed opening, he opened it. If a road was blocked, he found another. If someone was in danger, he moved before fear could ask permission. But grief had introduced him to a different kind of battlefield. One without coordinates and without an extraction plan. Since his wife Clara died 3 years earlier, Elias had learned to survive by reducing life to small, manageable rituals. Coffee before sunrise, firewood stacked by noon, mailbox checked only if the snow was not too deep, doors locked before the sky turned purple. After sunset, he did not open the front door, not for neighbors, not for weather, not even for memories, though they knocked often enough. That evening, the wind moved softly over the ridge, pushing loose snow across the porch in pale ribbons. Elias sat at the kitchen table with a chipped mug of black coffee he had reheated twice and still not finished. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke, old leather, and the plain vegetable soup he had made without salt because Clara had always complained he seasoned food like a man trying to punish it. Her voice came back to him at strange times, not loudly, never like a haunting in a storybook, but in small domestic ambushes. The empty hook where her blue scarf once hung, the second chair still angled toward the window, the jar of peppermint candies she had kept for visitors who never came anymore. Elias turned the page of a newspaper he was not reading. Outside, something touched the porch step. Not a heavy sound. Not the crack of a branch or the slap of wood. A light, precise tap. Then another. He held still. Old instincts rose inside him before thought could shape them, tightening his fingers around the mug, stilling his breath. The sound came again. Claws against frozen boards. Elias turned his head toward the front door. The cabin seemed to hold its breath with him. He stood slowly, more irritated at his own caution than at the noise, and crossed the room without turning on another light. At the window beside the door, he moved the curtain with 2 fingers and looked through the narrow gap. On the porch, sitting squarely in the glow spilling faintly from the kitchen, was a German shepherd. A female, Elias guessed, though he could not have said why at first. She was 7 or perhaps 8 years old, with thick sable fur dark along the spine and shoulders, warmer brown at the chest and legs, and a black mask that made her eyes look even deeper. Snowmelt had dampened parts of her coat, turning the fur into dark, heavy patches. Her ears stood upright, not frantic, not searching, but listening. Her front paws were planted neatly together at the edge of the mat, and her tail wrapped close around one side of her body. She looks neither starved nor wild. No foam at the mouth, no limp, no panic. She looked, absurdly, as if she had made an appointment and had arrived early enough to be considered polite. Elias frowned. "No," he muttered, though neither the dog nor the cabin had asked a question. The German shepherd stared at the door, not at the window, not at the food smells inside. At the door itself. Elias felt a strange annoyance move through him, sharp and unreasonable. Dogs had always known too much. Clara used to say that dogs could smell a lie before a man could finish dressing it in good manners. Elias had laughed then because laughter was easy when loss still belongs to other people. He let the curtain fall and stepped back. There were rules. They were not written down, but they held the cabin together. He did not open the door after dusk. He did not take in strays. He did not begin conversations he could not end. Still, after 10 minutes of pretending to return to his newspaper, he rose with a heavy sigh, found a dented metal bowl in the bottom cabinet, and filled it with leftover soup and scraps of bread. He went to the back door, unlocked it, and slipped outside into the cold without turning on the porch light. The air bit the skin above his collar. He circled around the side of the cabin, placed the bowl near the front steps, and retreated before the dog could come toward him. From inside he watched again through the curtain. The German shepherd did not move. Her nose twitched once, acknowledging the food with the minimum courtesy expected of a guest raised well. But she did not lower her head. She did not whine. She did not paw at the door. She simply sat there, facing the cabin, her breath showing in small silver clouds. Elias stared longer than he meant to. The old part of him began cataloging details. No visible collar, no fresh injury. Pads likely cold but not bleeding. Posture controlled, gaze fixed. Behavior intentional. That last word irritated him most. Intentional. People were intentional. Dogs were hungry, loyal, frightened, stubborn, affectionate, occasionally dramatic enough to qualify for local government. But this dog seemed to be waiting for something she already understood. After half an hour, Elias opened the back door again, this time louder, hoping the sound would startle her off the porch. It did not. The German shepherd flicked one ear in his direction and continued watching the front door. "Suit yourself," Elias said into the cold. His voice sounded rough from disuse, as if it had been stored in a drawer with old tools. By morning, the porch was empty. The bowl of food remained untouched, its surface frozen into a dull, pale crust. Elias stood over it in his coat and boots, feeling foolish in a way he had not felt since he was a young man. He told himself the dog had belonged to someone. A farm up the road, perhaps? A traveler's dog that had wandered from a stopped truck? Vermont was full of people who believed the dog could find its way home through blizzards, taxes, and possibly the Book of Revelation. He tossed the frozen scraps into the woods and scrubbed the bowl harder than necessary. Yet all day, the image returned to him. Sable fur, upright ears, patient eyes, paused together on the porch like a judge waiting for a confession. The second night, she came again. Elias knew the time because the old wall clock had just clicked past 7, and the minute hand was creeping toward 12 when the tapping began. Tap, tap, tap. He did not look at first. Pride, when it has nothing useful left to guard, often guards nonsense. He sat in his chair by the stove, pretending to mend a glove Clara would have told him to throw away years ago. The tapping stopped. That was worse. Silence made room for imagination, and imagination was a poor companion to a man who had spent years trying not to remember. Finally, Elias crossed to the window. The German shepherd sat in the same place as before, in the same composed posture, looking at the same closed door. The snow had stopped, and moonlight silvered the porch boards around her. She looked like a creature from an old myth sent to stand between a man and whatever he had buried under the floorboards of his own heart. On the third morning, Lottie Bell arrived with the mail. Lottie was 74, small but unbent, with a narrow frame wrapped in a red wool coat, bright white hair pinned beneath a knitted hat, and cheeks permanently pink from weather and opinions. She had delivered mail in Brindle Creek for 41 years, and considered every mailbox a chapter in a town-wide biography no one had officially asked her to write. Her hazel eyes were sharp behind square glasses, and her mouth had the dangerous cheerfulness of someone who could say "good morning" and make it sound like cross-examination. Lottie noticed the paw prints before Elias noticed her noticing them. She stood at the bottom of the porch, one hand on her mailbag, examining the pattern in the snow. "You expecting company with 4 feet?" she called. Elias opened the door only as far as the chain allowed, though it was late morning and therefore within his rules. He wore a dark flannel shirt, heavy trousers, and the expression of a man already regretting the conversation. "No. That's what makes company interesting." Lottie tilted her head toward the prince. "Big shepherd, I'd say. Female, older, not wandering. Wandering dogs leave messy stories. This one came and went like she knew where the punctuation belonged." "You reading snow now?" "At my age, I read anything that doesn't run away." She slid 2 envelopes through the gap. "Maybe you should let her in if she comes back." "I don't take in strange dogs. You took in that broken lawnmower in 2018 and talked to it for 6 months. That was different." "Of course. The mower had wheels, and the dog has judgment." Lottie smiled, but her eyes softened. She had known Clara. Everyone in Brindle Creek had known Clara, or at least believed they had. Clara Ward had been the kind of woman who remembered birthdays, soup preferences, and the exact tone a person used when saying they were fine but were not fine at all. "Open a door once in a while, Elias," Lottie said more gently. "Hinges get stiff when they're only used for keeping the world out." Elias looked away. "Doors lead to trouble." Lottie adjusted her mailbag on her shoulder. "Then congratulations. Your trouble has fur and very good manners." He closed the door harder than he meant to. The line stayed with him. That was the problem with Lottie Bell. She tossed words around like crumbs for birds, and somehow they grew claws. The next 3 nights unfolded with the same impossible rhythm. At 7:12, the German shepherd returned. Elias tried leaving food again, then water, then nothing at all. She accepted none of it. Once, he stepped onto the porch before sunset and said, "Go home," in the firm tone that had once made grown men straighten their backs. The dog looked at him, blinked slowly, and remained seated. It was not defiance. Defiance would have been easier. It was patience. And patience had a way of making a locked room feel smaller. Elias began noticing what he hated noticing. How she kept her body angled slightly away from the wind. How her paws trembled after long minutes in the cold. How she rose stiffly before leaving, as if age had begun whispering in her joints. She was not young. She was not invincible. Yet she came anyway. A ridiculous creature, he thought. A stubborn, solemn, weather-soaked, ridiculous creature. Then he realized he was standing at the window, waiting for her before the clock reached 12 minutes past 7, and that discovery unsettled him more than her visits. By the 7th night, the snow returned with a heavier hand. It fell thick and bright through the dark, covering the porch rail, swallowing the path, softening the world until every edge looked forgiven. Elias had not lit the front porch lamp, but the kitchen glow spilled through the window, catching flakes in midair like sparks from a cold fire. At 7:12, the tapping came. This time it was faint. He was already standing. He told himself he had risen only to prove she was not there. But when he pulled the curtain aside, the German shepherd sat on the porch, shoulders dusted white, breath trembling in the air. Her ears were upright, though one flickered against the wind. Her eyes met the door with the same patient certainty, but her body shivered now. Not dramatically, not enough to manipulate a sentimental fool, just enough to reveal that flesh, even brave flesh, had limits. Elias's hand went to the lock. He stopped. For a moment, the old rule stood between them like a wall: no doors after dusk, no strays, no beginnings. Beyond the door sat a dog who had asked for nothing, but had returned 7 times. Behind Elias stood a cabin full of all the things he had refused to touch: Clara's scarf, the second chair, the silence, the phone he never used to call his daughter. He felt anger rise, then grief beneath it. Then something smaller and more frightening than both: the possibility that the world had not finished with him. The lock clicked. The sound seemed louder than it should have been. Elias opened the door. The German shepherd did not rush inside. She did not leap, whine, or celebrate victory. She stood carefully, shook a thin veil of snow from her coat, and stepped across the threshold with the solemn dignity of an old priest entering a ruined chapel. Elias moved back, one hand still gripping the door. Warm air touched the dog's damp fur, releasing the scent of snow, pine needles, and distance. She paused on the braided rug Clara had chosen years before, lowered her head, and opened her mouth. Something small dropped from her jaws and struck the wooden floor with a dull, fragile sound. It was an old brass bell, tarnished, weathered, no larger than Elias's palm. It rolled once, then stopped near the toe of his boot. The German shepherd lifted her head and looked at him, not pleading, not frightened, waiting. And for the first time in 3 years, Elias Ward forgot to close the door. Morning came pale and hard over Rendell Creek, the kind of morning that made every window look blind and every chimney seem to be breathing carefully. Snow lay fresh across Hemlock Ridge, smooth in the places where no one had walked, and bruised gray where Elias Ward's boots had crossed the porch the night before. Inside the cabin, the old brass bell sat on the kitchen table beneath the yellow cone of a lamp, small enough to fit inside Elias's palm and heavy enough to disturb the whole room. The German shepherd had slept near the cold hearth, not on the blanket Elias had tossed down, but beside it, as if accepting comfort too easily would have weakened her argument. She was still unnamed to him, still a stranger with sable fur, damp paws, and eyes too steady for an ordinary lost dog. She had not begged. She had not explored the cabin. She had not sniffed at Clara's old chair or the pantry door or the boots by the wall. She had entered, placed the bell at his feet, and chosen a place where she could see both Elias and the front door. That bothered him. A starving dog would have searched for food. A frightened dog would have searched for escape. This one seemed to be guarding a question. Elias had stayed awake long after midnight, listening to the stove tick and the wind comb the roof, telling himself he was simply watching a stray until daylight. But men often lie most fluently when no one is around to correct them. By sunrise, he had cleaned the bell with a corner of an old towel and discovered the faint engraving along the rim. C.W. The 2 letters were nearly swallowed by tarnish, worn by years of fingers or weather or both. But they were there. C.W. Clara Ward, his wife's initials. Elias stared at them until the letters blurred. Anger came first, because anger was easier to hold than wonder. Anger had edges. Wonder slipped through the fingers. "Where did you get this?" he asked the dog, his voice low. The German shepherd lifted her head from the floor and looked at him as though the answer had been available all night, if only he had been less committed to being stubborn. The bell should not have existed. Clara had never owned one, at least not one Elias remembered. and he remembered objects with the precision of a man who had once survived by noticing what belonged and what did not. After she died, he had boxed her sewing things, her recipe cards, the blue scarf with a frayed end, the church volunteer badges, the old photographs, and every Christmas ornament she had insisted had personality, but it was clearly just chipped. He had not thrown much away. He told himself it was because sorting grief took time, though the truth was simpler and less noble. Keeping her things untouched allowed him to pretend he had not chosen what to do with her absence. But no brass bell had been among them. He turned it over again. The clapper inside was intact, though dull with age. When he shook it gently, it gave a faint, cracked sound, not cheerful, not sharp, but intimate, like a memory clearing its throat. The German shepherd rose at once, her ears pricked forward. She crossed the kitchen in 3 silent steps and stood beside him, eyes fixed on the bell. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "No," he said, though once again no one had asked a question. "I'm not doing this." The dog blinked. Elias hated how much judgment a blink could contain. He set the bell on the table and made coffee with more force than the task required. The kettle rattled. The spoon struck the mug. The chair scraped the floor. All the while, the German shepherd stood near the door, not whining, not pacing, simply waiting with that maddening patience that seemed less like obedience and more like command. Outside, the morning widened over the ridge. By 9, the dog walked to the front door, turned back, and looked at him. By 10, she repeated the gesture. At 11, she put one paw on the threshold and held it there. Elias leaned against the counter, arms crossed over his chest. He was tall, broad, and still physically imposing despite the years. But there was something almost childish in the way he resisted that silent instruction. Once, other men had followed his hand signals through darkness. Now he was being maneuvered by a dog who had not even bothered to learn his objections. He lasted until late morning. That was how he would later describe it to himself, as if he had endured an interrogation rather than a stare. He put on his heavy coat, wool cap, and gloves, then tucked the brass bell into the deep pocket near his ribs. The German shepherd's tail moved once, a restrained sweep, no more triumphant than a church deacon acknowledging that the stubborn sinner had finally stood up from the back pew. "Don't get proud," Elias muttered. The dog stepped onto the porch, down into the snow, and paused at the gate. She did not run ahead. She waited until he latched the door behind him. Hemlock Ridge sloped toward town through pines and bare maples, the road narrow and rutted, the air bright enough to make him squint. Each breath pulled cold into his chest. He had walked this road many times in the first year after Clara's death, back when people still invited him to dinners and he still considered refusing a decision rather than a habit. Then the walks had grown shorter. Then they stopped. The town had not moved, but it felt farther now, as though his grief had stretched the road. The German shepherd led with calm certainty, choosing the packed snow along the shoulder, occasionally turning her head to check whether he followed. She did not tug because there was no leash. She did not bark. She did not hurry. That was the worst part. There was no emergency Elias could use to understand her, no wounded man, no smoke column, no crying child. Only a dog, a bell, and a path he did not want to take. At the first bend he stopped. The dog stopped too. She looked back at him, one paw lifted above the snow. A ridiculous thought came to him. She looked like a senior officer waiting for a junior man to finish embarrassing himself. "Fine," he said, "but I'm not saluting." The dog lowered her paw and continued. By the time they reached the edge of Brindle Creek, people noticed. Of course they did. A man could vanish for months in a small town, but the moment he returned with a mysterious German shepherd, 3 curtains moved, 2 trucks slowed down, and one gossip network lit up brighter than the Christmas tree in front of the Methodist church. Brindle Creek was a town of low brick storefronts, clapboard houses, sugar maples, and practical people who believed privacy was sacred right up until it became interesting. Mrs. Avery, the owner of Avery's Market, stepped out from beneath her green awning with a crate of oranges in her arms. She was a broad-hipped woman in her early 60s, with warm brown skin, silver-threaded black curls tucked beneath a flour-dusted cap, and the steady kindness of someone who had fed half the town through storms, funerals, and bad marriages. Her husband had died 12 years earlier, and since then she had run the market like a small kingdom governed by soup, credit, and stern affection. "Elias Ward," she called, surprised enough to forget the oranges were heavy. "Didn't know the mountain had returned you."
Elias nodded without stopping. He did not trust his voice among witnesses.
Mrs. Avery's gaze dropped to the German Shepherd. "That dog belongs to somebody?" Elias almost said no, then realized he did not know. "She found me," he answered. Mrs. Avery's eyebrows rose. "Dogs don't usually find men by accident." The words followed him down the sidewalk like a second set of footprints. Near the post office, Lottie Bell spotted him through the window and emerged with the speed of a woman who had been waiting all morning for the universe to prove her right. In daylight, Lottie seemed even smaller inside her red coat, but her presence filled the snowy walk as efficiently as a marching band. Her white hair escaped her hat in wisps, and her glasses had fogged from the warmth inside. "Well, look at that," she said. "The hinges still work." Elias kept walking. "Don't start." "I haven't started. This is merely the overture." She bent slightly toward the German Shepherd, not reaching out, which earned her a brief, assessing look from the dog. Lottie was clever enough to let animals make the first decision. "Handsome girl," Lottie murmured. "Older, well-trained, not a runaway unless she ran away from being underestimated." Elias touched the bell through his coat pocket. "You ever seen a brass bell with Clara's initials?" That stopped Lottie's smile. The change in her face was small, but Elias saw it. Lottie Bell, who could turn town rumors into weather reports, suddenly became careful. "Clara had many little projects," she said. "That doesn't answer me." "No," Lottie admitted. "It doesn't." For a moment, Elias thought she knew more. Maybe she did. But the German Shepherd moved then, stepping between them and looking down the road toward the east end of town. The dog's body had shifted from patient to purposeful. Lottie followed the dog's gaze, and the humor drained from her expression. "Elias," she said quietly, "that road goes to the old station." He looked toward the line of bare trees beyond Main Street, where the abandoned railway spur disappeared beneath snow and scrub. "I know where it goes." "Do you know why she does?" Elias had no answer. The dog began walking. The old Brindle Creek station sat beyond the last row of houses, a faded wooden building beside tracks that had not carried passengers in nearly 20 years. Once the station had been the town's little temple of departures and returns, with mothers waving from the platform, children pressing coins on the rails, and men in Sunday coats pretending not to cry when trains took their sons away. Now the roof sagged under snow, the windows were boarded, and weeds slept beneath ice along the platform edge. A small fire had damaged part of the rear wall years earlier, and after that the town had locked it up, argued about repairs, forgotten the arguments, and allowed the building to become one more place memory used without permission. Elias had not come here since Clara's memorial gathering, not the funeral itself, which had been at the church, all lilies and casseroles and people saying she was in a better place, as if that made the kitchen less empty. The gathering after had spilled through town, people telling stories about Clara at the diner, the church basement, the post office, and even the old station, though Elias had left early. He remembered standing near the tracks that day, unable to tolerate how easily people spoke of her goodness. He had wanted to shout that goodness did not keep lungs breathing, did not make the bed warm, did not stop a man from waking at 3 a.m., expecting to hear his wife turning a page. Instead, he had walked home and locked the door. Now the German Shepherd led him to the station steps and climbed them without hesitation. The platform groaned beneath Elias's boots. The dog moved along the boarded front, sniffing not like a scavenger, but like a reader, following lines in an old book. She passed the ticket window, the rusted bench, the crooked notice board layered with dead staples and paper ghosts. At the far side, where a narrow walkway curved toward the rear, she stopped before a smaller door Elias had never noticed closely. 2 planks had been nailed across it, weathered gray, their nail heads dark with rust. Snow had drifted against the threshold. The German shepherd lowered her head, sniffed the seam, then raised one front paw and scratched lightly at the wood. Once. Twice. Not frantic, not desperate. Deliberate. Elias stood behind her, the bell heavy in his pocket. "This is trespassing," he said, "because men who have no good argument often reach for rules." The dog scratched again. From somewhere behind him, a crow called from the roofline, sounding exactly like it disapproved of bureaucracy. Elias looked around. No one had followed them this far, though he could imagine half the town knowing by supper that he had gone to the station with a dog and a face like bad weather. He crouched slowly, his knees objecting with the private bitterness of aging joints, and brushed snow from the lower plank. The wood was old, the nails were stubborn. He found a loose edge, pulled, and felt the first plank shift. It came away with a crack that echoed along the empty platform. The dog stepped back, giving him room. That too unsettled him. She knew when to wait and when to move aside. The second plank was harder. Elias worked it loose with a rusted metal bar he found near the wall, each pull sending flakes of old paint into the snow. His breath came heavier. His shoulder ached. The German shepherd stood beside him, silent as a carved guardian. When the plank finally tore free, the door remained stuck. Elias pressed his palm against it. The wood was swollen from years of weather. He pushed once, then harder. The door groaned inward a few inches, releasing a breath of trapped air, dust, cold ashes, old paper, and something faintly sweet, like lavender sealed too long in a drawer. Clara had smelled of lavender soap. Elias froze. The dog looked up at him. For one wild second he wanted to put the planks back, walk home, and let the bell remain unexplained. But grief, like winter, has a way of making cowards of men who were brave in every other season. He pushed again. The door opened enough for him to step inside. Light fell through gaps in the boarded windows, pale and narrow, striping the dusty floor. The room beyond was not empty. Shapes waited beneath sheets. Stacked chairs lined one wall. Cardboard boxes sagged in a corner. A table stood near the center, its surface covered in dust thick enough to soften the edges of everything it touched. And on the far wall hung a wooden sign, tilted slightly, as if time had tried to pull it down and failed. Elias crossed the room one slow step at a time. The German shepherd followed but did not pass him. The sign was coated in gray dust. He lifted a gloved hand and wiped across the boards. Letters emerged beneath his fingers, hand-painted in dark blue. The Open Door Project. Elias stared at the words. He did not understand them, and yet his chest tightened as if some part of him did. Below the lettering, in smaller script, was a curve of handwriting he knew better than his own signature. Clara's handwriting had always leaned slightly to the right, graceful but practical. The handwriting of a woman who could label jam jars, write condolence cards, and leave grocery lists that somehow sounded like moral instructions. Elias brushed away more dust. Under the title, Clara had written a line in fading paint. For the ones who stopped knocking, and the ones still waiting to be heard. The old brass bell in Elias's pocket seemed to grow heavier. Behind him, the German shepherd sat quietly on the cold floor. Elias did not turn around. He could not. The room, the sign, the hidden door, the dog, the initials on the bell, all of it had gathered around him like a jury. Outside, the wind moved over the abandoned tracks. Inside, Elias Ward stood before his dead wife's secret, and felt for the first time in years that a door had opened behind him, and there was no simple way to close it again. Elias Ward stood inside the sealed room of the old Brindle Creek station, while winter light cut through the boarded windows in thin, slanted blades. Dust drifted in the air each time the wind slipped through the cracks, rising and falling like ash from a fire long forgotten. Outside, the abandoned tracks lay buried beneath snow, but inside, the room felt strangely untouched, not preserved exactly, but paused, as if someone had stepped out for a moment and intended to return with fresh coffee, clean blankets, and another impossible act of kindness. The German shepherd sat near the door, sable fur still damp from the walk, ears alert, brown eyes fixed not on Elias, but on the room itself. She did not sniff wildly or wander from corner to corner. She seemed to know where everything belonged. That was what kept tightening the old muscles in Elias's chest. A lost dog would search. This dog remembered. Elias turned back to the wooden sign on the wall. The Open Door Project. The words were simple, almost modest, but beneath them Clara's handwriting bent across the dust like a voice that had waited years to be heard. For the ones who stopped knocking, and the ones still waiting to be heard. Elias read the line 3 times. The first time he read it as a sentence, the second time as evidence, the third time as an accusation. The room was small but full, arranged with the practical tenderness that had been Clara's signature. Folding chairs stood stacked along one wall, their metal legs tied with twine. Several wool blankets rested on a shelf, each folded into a square so neat that Elias could almost see Clara's hands smoothing the corners. There were tins of tea, chipped mugs, a cracked sugar bowl, a first aid kit, and a wooden crate filled with leashes in different sizes. On the far table sat paper files arranged in faded folders, each labeled with dates, street names, and short notes written in black ink. Elias stepped closer, moving as carefully as a man entering a chapel after doubting God for too long. A faint lavender scent still clung to the room, trapped in the paper and fabric, mingling with old smoke from the small fire that had once damaged the rear wall. He touched one of the blankets. The wool was rough under his fingers. Clara had hated waste. She had believed worn things still had work left in them if someone would stop calling them ruined. Elias had often teased her about that. Now, standing among these rescued objects, he realized she may have been speaking about people all along. A large corkboard hung near the back of the room, half covered with curling index cards, faded photographs, and hand-drawn maps of Brindle Creek. Elias wiped dust from the board with his sleeve. Names appeared beneath his hand. Not famous names, not emergency names. Quiet names. Dorothy Hale, widow, Elm Street, porch light out since November. Samuel Pike, retired mechanic, bad hip, refuses help if asked directly. Reverend Owen Bell, grieving son, smiles too quickly. Nora Finch, diabetic, lives alone, forgets wood delivery. Arthur Cole, Korean War veteran, sleeps in chair, answers only if dog waits first. Each note was brief, almost clinical. But Clara's care lived in the details. Dorothy liked peppermint tea, but pretended not to. Samuel would accept an extra loaf, but not charity. Nora trusted dogs more than doctors. Arthur disliked loud knocking because it made him think of bad news. Elias stood motionless. He knew some of these people. Or rather, he knew the surface of them, the way a man knows storefronts he passes but never enters. Dorothy Hale had been a tiny woman with a cloud of white hair and watery blue eyes, always wearing purple gloves even when the weather did not require them. Samuel Pike was thick-shouldered and bow-legged, with a beard the color of iron filings and a temper that mostly protected embarrassment. Reverend Owen Bell, Lottie's younger brother, was a narrow-faced man in his late 60s with tired green eyes and the gentle voice of someone who had comforted others so long he no longer knew how to ask for comfort himself. Nora Finch, A retired school secretary with thin brown skin, cropped gray curls, and a habit of correcting grammar even during medical appointments, had once sent Clara home with 3 jars of jam after Clara helped shovel her steps. Arthur Cole had died the year after Clara. Elias remembered seeing the notice in the paper and thinking, with the cold distance grief sometimes creates, that another old soldier had slipped out of formation. He had not known Arthur had once needed a dog to sit outside before he could open a door. The German Shepherd rose and walked to the corkboard. She touched her nose to the lower left corner, where several cards had fallen and curled on the floor. Elias crouched, joints stiff, and picked them up. On one card, Clara had sketched a route from the church basement to a small blue house near Maple Ditch Road. On another, she had written, "Do not rush. Silence is not always refusal." Elias read the sentence slowly. His throat tightened. Clara had understood silence. Not the empty kind, not the rude kind, but the kind that sat beside pain, because words would only frighten it. During the last year of her life, he had mistaken her busyness for distraction. She was always going somewhere: the church hall, the market, the station, the library, someone's back porch. He had assumed she was trying to outrun her illness or fill her days with errands, so neither of them had to speak directly about the shadow in the room. Sometimes he had resented it. Sometimes, when she came home tired and smiling, he had wanted to say, "Stay here, sit with me, be scared where I can see you." But Elias had been trained to solve problems, not confess need. So he had grunted, poured her tea, and let her go again. Now he saw the shape of those days differently. Clara had not been running from death. She had been building doors before she ran out of time to open them. Near the corner of the room, beside a wooden cabinet with one broken hinge, a square of glass caught the light. Elias stepped over a collapsed cardboard box and lifted a photograph from a low shelf. Dust covered the frame so thickly that the image beneath looked like something underwater. He wiped the glass with his glove. Clara appeared slowly, as if winter itself were remembering her. She stood in front of the station on a spring day, wearing her blue raincoat, the one with the missing button near the collar. He had been 66 then, perhaps 67, slender but strong, with silver blonde hair braided over one shoulder, and warm gray eyes that could make strangers admit they had not eaten lunch. Her skin was fair, lined lightly around the mouth from years of smiling at people who believed they were not worth the trouble. Clara had never been loud. Her strength had been quieter and, in Elias's opinion, far more dangerous. She could sit beside a grieving woman for an hour without saying anything foolish. She could make a proud man accept help by pretending he was doing her a favor. She could look at Elias after one of his hard silences and somehow make him feel both known and forgiven, which had annoyed him greatly because forgiveness was harder to argue with than blame. Beside Clara in the photograph sat the same German Shepherd, younger then, her sable coat glossier, her muzzle darker, her body leaner and more powerful. The dog wore a simple leather collar with a small brass tag. Her eyes were exactly the same, patient, sober, almost ancient. Elias turned the frame over. A piece of tape held a folded note against the cardboard backing. His fingers hesitated before opening it. The handwriting was Clara's. "Mara, the one who knows how to wait better than any of us, for visits, grief calls, quiet houses, and stubborn men." Elias stared at the first word. Mara. He looked at the German Shepherd. The dog had sat down beside him, front paws together, head lifted. "Mara," he said, and the name left his mouth awkwardly, like a word from a language he had forgotten. The dog's ears moved forward. Her tail gave one low sweep against the dusty floor. Not excitement, recognition. Elias said it again, softer. "Mara." The room seemed to change around the name. Until that moment, she had been a mystery with fur, an intrusion, a messenger he had not invited. Now she belonged to the hidden architecture of Clara's life, not a stray, not an accident, not trouble with good manners. Mara had known Clara. Mara had stood where Clara stood. Mara had been taught by the woman Elias had loved and failed to fully understand. He felt an irrational flash of jealousy so sharp it almost made him laugh. This dog had shared years of Clara that he had not seen. This dog knew roots, rooms, faces, habits, perhaps even secrets Clara had kept not out of betrayal, but mercy. Elias set the photograph on the table as carefully as if it were breathing. More files waited beneath the photograph. Elias opened one and found training notes. Not military training, though he recognized discipline in the pattern. Clara had written dates and exercises. Wait outside without scratching. Sit until invited. No jumping. No licking hands unless invited. Head on knee only if person reaches first. Leave if voice rises. Return next day. Elias read the list with growing astonishment. Clara had trained Mara not merely to comfort, but to respect human fear. That broke something in him more quietly than grief had. So much of the world treated lonely people like locked boxes that simply needed harder keys. Clara had taught a dog the opposite. Do not force the door. Do not punish the person for staying inside. Come back. Try again. Wait. Elias thought of the 7 nights on his porch, then imagined more nights he had not seen before he noticed her. Dark evenings when Mara may have sat beyond the reach of his window, patient as a saint, and twice as inconvenient. You were trained for this, he whispered. Mara blinked once. Elias almost heard Lottie Bell saying, Of course she was. Some of us train for war. Some of us train for mercy. Mercy, he thought, might have required more endurance. On another table lay a ledger bound in green cloth. The pages were filled with Clara's notes, neat columns of dates, visits, and outcomes. Elias turned them carefully. March 5th. Dorothy opened after 11 minutes, accepted tea, asked about dog's age. March 19th. Samuel refused help. Dog waited. Left firewood anyway. April 2nd. Arthur spoke for first time about nightmares. No advice given, just listened. April 14th. Nora laughed when Mara sneezed into flour. Good day. Elias paused at that. He could see it. Clara in some warm kitchen, flour in the air, Nora laughing, Mara guilty and dignified at once. The image hurt, but not cruelly. It was the pain of discovering light had existed in rooms he never entered. Then his eyes caught a card pinned beneath the ledger strap. The ink was darker than the others, newer, perhaps, though still years old. Elias Ward, Hemlock Ridge. No hard knocking, no surprise visits after dark unless dog initiates. Do not use pity. Do not mention moving on. Leave space. Let Mara wait. He stopped breathing for a moment. There it was, his name, written among the lonely, the grieving, the unreachable. He had thought himself outside Clara's work because he was her husband, because love should have made him known without notes. Instead, Clara had seen him more clearly than he had seen himself. She had listed him not as a failure, not as a burden, but as someone whose door required a different kind of approach. That mercy nearly undid him. Anger rose again, but weaker this time. Why didn't you tell me? He asked the room. The room did not answer. Neither did the dead. Mara sat beside the photograph, still and watchful, not wagging, not performing affection, not trying to soften the blow. Her presence was almost formal, as if she had come not to heal him quickly, but to testify that Clara had loved him enough to prepare for his silence. Elias sank into one of the folding chairs. It complained beneath him with a metallic squeak that sounded almost comic. And for one brief, absurd second, he imagined Clara scolding the chair for lacking manners. His laugh came out broken and startled. Then the laugh vanished. He covered his face with one hand. He did not cry in the dramatic way stories often demand of men who have carried too much. Elias had spent a lifetime controlling his body under pressure, and old habits do not collapse all at once. But his breathing changed, his shoulders lowered. Something guarded inside him loosened by a fraction, not enough to call surrender, but enough that the room no longer felt like an ambush. He looked again at Clara's photograph. He saw now what he had missed in her last years. Not secrecy, but labor. Not distance, but devotion spread wider than his own wounded need could comprehend. She had been dying, and still she had made a map for other people to be found. He had been alive, and he had made a house into a bunker. Mara rose suddenly. Elias lowered his hand. The German shepherd walked to the central table, sniffed beneath it, then crouched and pushed her nose against something hidden behind a stack of collapsed cardboard. She pawed once, carefully, then backed away and looked at Elias. He stood, wiped his eyes with the heel of his hand as if dust were to blame, and knelt beside the table. Underneath, tucked behind a loose floorboard and an old canvas bag, was a rectangular tin box the color of storm clouds. It had a small latch, but no lock. Mara hooked one paw near it and dragged it forward with surprising care. The box scraped against the floor, leaving a clean line through the dust. Elias lifted it onto the table. His hands felt too large for the delicate latch. Inside lay a blue painted key, its paint chipped at the edges, and an envelope yellowed with age. The envelope bore Clara's handwriting. Only open when he opens the door himself. Beneath that, written in the same steady hand, was his name, Elias. Mara sat at his feet, eyes lifted, silent as winter before a bell rings. The afternoon came down over Brendel Creek in a dull silver hush, the kind of winter afternoon that made even familiar roads look like they belonged to someone else. Elias Ward walked back from the old station with the blue painted key in one coat pocket and Clara's envelope in the other, while Mara moved ahead of him through the snow with the calm certainty of a creature who had already chosen the next chapter. The town behind them had begun to glow with early lamplight, windows turning honey-colored against the cold, chimneys lifting thin ribbons of smoke into the pale sky. Elias did not look back. He had spent decades learning how to leave places without turning around. But this was different. The old station had not been a place he left behind. It had followed him. Its dust clung to his gloves. Its lavender ghost seemed lodged in his throat. Clara's handwriting burned inside his pocket more fiercely than any weapon he had ever carried. At the edge of Hemlock Ridge, Mara stopped and looked back, her sable coat dark against the snow, her ears high, her brown eyes unreadable. Now that Elias knew her name, she no longer seemed less mysterious. If anything, the name made her worse. A mystery could be ignored. A name could not. The cabin looked smaller when they returned, as if the old station had made it shrink by comparison. Elias unlocked the front door before dusk for the second time in 2 days, and the action unsettled him so deeply that he stood on the threshold for several seconds without stepping inside. Mara slipped past him, crossed the braided rug with quiet paws, and sat near the kitchen table. He did not explore. She did not ask to be fed. She simply watched him remove his coat, hang it on the peg beside Clara's blue scarf, and take the envelope from his pocket. The paper was yellowed at the edges, but Clara's handwriting remained steady. Elias Ward. Not Eli, as she had called him on soft mornings. Not sweetheart, as she had written on grocery lists when she wanted him to buy butter without returning with motor oil and canned beans. Elias Ward. The formal shape of his name made him feel like a witness being called forward. He placed the envelope on the kitchen table and walked away from it. For the next hour, he behaved like a man performing ordinary tasks while a small bird bled silently on the table behind him. He built up the fire, though the stove already held heat. He rinsed the coffee mug, dried it, then rinsed it again. He checked the latch on the back door. He counted the cans in the pantry, though he knew exactly how many were there because he had counted them the day before. Mara remained at the edge of the kitchen, her body settled, but her attention unbroken. She was 7 years old, perhaps older, old enough for pale hairs to gather around her muzzle, old enough for stiffness to show when she rose, but nothing about her felt diminished. She carried age like a medal, not a burden. Elias caught her looking at him and felt irritation flare. "Don't," he said. Mara tilted her head. "Don't look at me like that." Her ears moved slightly, and the motion was so mild it seemed almost polite. Elias pointed at her with the dish towel. "You heard me. Don't sit there looking like Clara." Mara did not move. That, somehow, was the answer. Elias threw the towel onto the counter. She did that too. Looked at a man until he confessed things he had no intention of confessing. The fire crackled. Snow tapped softly against the window. The envelope waited. By late afternoon, the cabin had become crowded with things that were not physically there. Clara stood in every corner, not as a ghost, not as a figure in white, but as memory in its most inconvenient form. She was in the peppermint tin by the stove. She was in the chair angled toward the window because she had liked to watch chickadees argue over seed. She was in the chipped blue bowl Elias never used because it had been her favorite. She was in the silence after he muttered something bitter, and no one answered with a laugh. Elias had loved his wife with the stubborn loyalty of an old oak, but love did not automatically make a man brave in the right ways. He had been brave in storms, brave in foreign dark, brave when other men needed him to become steadier than fear. But in the last months of Clara's illness, he had become clumsy. He brought medicine on time, drove to appointments, lifted her when she was weak, changed sheets, cooked badly, watched her breathing when she slept. He had done the tasks. Tasks were safe. But when Clara had wanted to talk about what would remain after her, Elias often found reasons to fix something in another room. A leaking faucet, a loose hinge, a stack of firewood, anything with a solution. Now the solution sat sealed on his kitchen table, and he hated it. The phone rang just after dusk. Elias flinched before he looked at it, annoyed by his own reaction. The caller ID displayed Grace Ward, his daughter. Her name glowed on the small screen with the soft cruelty of ordinary technology. Grace was 43 now, though Elias still sometimes imagined her at 16, long-legged and furious, slamming the truck door because he had missed another school concert. In adulthood, she had become tall and lean like Clara's father. With auburn hair she wore in a loose knot, pale skin freckled across the nose, and gray-green eyes that saw too much and forgave slowly. She worked as a counselor at a community center 2 towns over, helping families talk through pain she and her father still stepped around like broken glass. Grace had Clara's patience, but not Clara's habit of hiding hurt beneath warmth. If Grace was wounded, her face held it plainly. If she was angry, silence gathered around her like weather before thunder. Elias stared at the ringing phone until it stopped. A moment later, a voicemail notification appeared. He did not play it. Mara's eyes shifted from the phone to him. "No," he said, though his voice had lost force. "That's not part of this." Mara looked back at the envelope. Elias laughed once, without humor. "Of course. Everything is part of this now." He made supper and did not eat it. He opened the front door once to let Mara out, but she only stepped onto the porch, sniffed the cold, then returned to her place by the kitchen table. He poured coffee and forgot to drink it. The envelope seemed to grow larger as the room darkened. At last, near evening, Elias sat down across from it. Mara rose and came nearer, lowering herself beside the table with slow dignity. Her tail rested against the floor. Her eyes did not demand. That was what undid him. A demand could be refused. Patience made refusal feel childish. Elias slid one finger beneath the flap and opened the envelope. The first thing he noticed was the date. Clara had written a letter 9 months before she died. His hands tightened around the paper. The second thing he noticed was the steadiness of her handwriting. No tremor yet. No sign of the weakness that would come later. This was Clara before the final winter stripped her down to bone and breath. This was Clara while she was still moving through town, carrying secret maps and wool blankets, training a German shepherd to wait outside closed doors. My dear Elias, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means you opened the door yourself. No one dragged you to it, no one broke it down, no one argued you into mercy. That matters. Elias swallowed. Mara rested her chin on her front paws. Clara wrote that the Open Door Project had not been created to fix people, because people were not broken machines, no matter how badly frightened neighbors wanted a simple repair. She had started it after noticing how many houses in Brindle Creek stayed lit late into the night with no visitors. How many people stopped attending church without anyone asking why? How many widows laughed too quickly at the market? How many old men let mail gather because opening envelopes felt too much like receiving verdicts? She had begun with soup and blankets, but soup could be refused and blankets could be called charity. Mara changed everything. A dog could sit where a person could not. A dog could wait without embarrassing the one being waited for. A dog could make loneliness feel less like failure and more like weather that might pass if someone stayed nearby long enough. Elias read slowly, each sentence opening a room he had not known existed. Mara was trained not to rush into anyone's life, Clara wrote. She was taught to wait at the door, to leave when anger rose, to return another day, to never treat a closed door as a final answer. Some people are not keeping the world out because they hate it, Eli. Some are holding the door shut because they believe that if it opens, everything inside them will fall onto the floor, and no one will stay to help pick it up. Elias stopped reading. He could feel the heat of the stove against his side, the roughness of the paper beneath his thumb, the weight of years gathering behind his ribs. The sentence had found him too cleanly. He wanted to be angry at Clara for writing it. He wanted to accuse her of making him into one of her projects, a sad note on a corkboard, a stubborn case for a dog with holy eyes. But even as anger rose, grief rose beneath it, and beneath grief something more fragile. Recognition. Clara had known, not guessed, known. She had seen the fortress he was building, while he still believed he was only locking up for the night. He forced himself to continue. I did not make this for you because I thought you were weak, Clara wrote. I made it because strength can become a locked room if no one teaches it how to open again. You have spent your life moving toward danger for other people. But grief is different, my love. Grief sits inside the house. It wears your clothes. It drinks your coffee. You cannot defeat it by guarding the door. The paper trembled. Elias placed it flat on the table and pressed his palm over it. Damn you, Clara, he whispered, but there was no venom in the words. Only the exhausted awe of a man realizing he had been loved with more strategy than he deserved. The next part was about Grace. Elias nearly folded the letter then. His daughter's name had always been the door behind the door. Clara wrote that Grace had tried many times to come home after the funeral. She had driven up Hemlock Ridge with soup, bread, a jar of blueberry jam, a box of old family photographs, and once a ridiculous cactus because she said Elias needed something alive that did not require emotional conversation. Elias remembered none of it because he had not opened the door. He remembered the silence afterward, the way weeks became months, the way Grace's calls shortened, then thinned. He had told himself she was busy. He had told himself she had her own life. He had told himself children eventually learned to stop needing old men who had failed at softness. Clara's letter offered no accusation. That made it worse. You love Grace, Clara wrote. I know that. Grace knows it too, though knowing and feeling are not the same thing. She has stood outside your grief longer than you realize. Do not mistake her tiredness for lack of love. Even the faithful get cold when left on the porch too long. Elias closed his eyes. For a moment he saw Grace at 8 years old, asleep against his shoulder during a snowstorm power outage, her small hands tangled in his shirt. He saw Grace at 22, standing beside Clara in the kitchen, both women laughing because Elias had tried to bake a birthday cake and produced something that looked like a defensive structure. He saw Grace after the funeral, pale and rigid in a black coat, wanting to reach for him, and not knowing whether he would step away. Elias had believed his silence protected her from the ruin inside him. Now he saw it differently. His pain had not stayed neatly within his ribs. It had leaked under the door, across the porch, down the road, covering the people who still loved him in a cold they had not chosen. Mara rose and came closer. She did not put her head on his knee. Clara had trained her well. She waited until Elias lowered one hand. Only then did Mara press her muzzle lightly against his fingers. The contact was warm, brief, and devastating. At the bottom of the letter, Clara's handwriting grew smaller, as if she had been tired when she finished. There is more you need to know, but not in this house. The blue key belongs to the white house beside Miller Lake. May Whitcomb will understand. She kept the last records when I could not. The project did not end because I died. It stopped because everyone who could carry it thought they were alone. Elias read the final sentence twice. Mara will know the way. The German Shepherd lifted her head before Elias spoke, as if she had been listening for those exact words from the paper itself. Elias reached into his pocket and placed the blue key on the table. Mara stood at once. Her ears came forward. Her body changed from patient witness to purposeful guide. She took the key gently between her teeth, careful not to bite down on the chipped paint, and turned toward the front door. Outside, evening had thickened over Hemlock Ridge. The porch lay blue with snow, the road beyond fading into winter shadow. Elias stared at the open letter, at Clara's name, at the old brass bell beside the lamp, then at Mara waiting by the door with the blue key held in her mouth. This time, Mara was not asking him to understand. She was asking him to move. Elias rose slowly, and for the second time in 2 days he reached for the door before darkness could decide for him. Night had not fully taken Brindle Creek when Elias Ward followed Mara down from Hemlock Ridge with the blue key held carefully in the German Shepherd's mouth. The world seemed built from 2 colors now, the deepening blue of snow and the amber glow leaking from distant windows. Elias had left the cabin without finishing his coffee, without locking the back door twice, without obeying the small rituals that had kept him stitched together for 3 years. That alone made him feel as if he were walking without his skin. The road toward Miller Lake curved east beyond town, past bare sugar maples and sleeping fields where old stone walls rose like the ribs of buried giants. Mara moved ahead with steady purpose, sable coat dark against the snow, paws choosing the safest path without needing command. The blue-painted key remained between her teeth, and she carried it with a delicacy that seemed almost ceremonial. Elias watched her, and felt the strange humiliation of being led not by an enemy, not by orders, not even by conscience, but by a dog who had inherited more of Clara's courage than he had managed to keep. He wanted to turn back, not dramatically, not like a coward fleeing a battlefield, more like an old man who had realized too late that the dead sometimes leave instructions and the living are expected to obey them. The white house beside Miller Lake stood at the end of a narrow lane lined with frozen reeds and low birch trees. It was smaller than Elias expected, weathered but clean, with peeling white clapboard, blue shutters, and a porch crowded with clay pots that held only winter's brown remains. A single lamp glowed in the front window. Beyond the house, Miller Lake lay black and still beneath a thin skin of ice, reflecting the last strip of violet sky. The place had the lonely dignity of something that had refused to fall apart out of pure stubbornness. Mara climbed the porch steps and set the key down on the mat. Then she sat. Elias stood below the steps, his breath clouding in front of him, suddenly aware of his height, his coat, his boots, his rough hands, the way grief had made him look like a man arriving to collect debts. Before he could knock, the door opened. May Whitcomb filled the doorway like a small queen of an untidy kingdom. She was 82, though her posture still held the remnants of someone who had once moved quickly through hospital halls with a tray in one hand and authority in the other. She was short, round through the middle, and wrapped in a faded green cardigan over a blue house dress. Her hair was silver white, cut blunt at her jaw, and one side had escaped its comb entirely, giving her the look of a woman recently interrupted by either sleep or revolution. Her skin was pale and finely wrinkled, with rose patches at the cheeks, and her eyes were dark, sharp, and watery all at once. Those eyes went first to Mara, then to the key, then to Elias. "Well?" May said. Her voice was low, dry, and cracked at the edges, like paper that had survived a fire. "Took him long enough." Elias stiffened. "You were expecting me?" "I was expecting the dog. The dog has better manners and a more reliable schedule." May leaned one hand on the doorframe and studied him. "You must be Elias." "Clara said you were tall enough to make doorways feel guilty." She glanced at his beard and weathered face. "She forgot to mention you came with thunderclouds installed in both eyebrows." Mara picked up the key, stepped past May, and entered the house without waiting for Elias's pride to recover. May turned and followed the dog inside. "Close the door if you're coming in. I heat the house for humans, not for all of Vermont." Elias entered because walking away would have required more strength than staying. The house smelled of old books, lemon polish, tea leaves, and something faintly medicinal. Along one wall stood framed photographs. Nurses in white uniforms from another era, a young May with dark hair pinned neatly beneath a cap, Clara laughing beside a church table stacked with canned goods, and several pictures of Mara at different ages. In one photograph, a much younger Mara sat beside 3 elderly women on a porch, all of them smiling as if the dog had just said something wise and slightly improper. The living room was warm but cluttered with purpose. Stacks of folders sat on a sideboard. A walker leaned near the hall. A basket of yarn rested beside an armchair. On the coffee table, 2 teacups waited, though one had no saucer and the other held a pair of reading glasses. May noticed him noticing. "I used to be organized. Then my memory started playing hide and seek with small objects. Last week I found the sugar in the linen closet and a washcloth in the flour tin. Neither improved the other." She moved toward the kitchen with a slow, careful gait that revealed the pain in her knees. "Sit, Elias Ward. You look like a man trying to decide whether furniture is a trap." He did not sit immediately. Old habit made him scan the room, exits, windows, loose rugs, possible hazards. Then he remembered he was in an old woman's house, not a hostile building, and felt foolish. May watched his eyes move. "Still counting ways out?" Elias looked at her. "Old training." "No," May said, filling a kettle at the sink. "Old hurt wearing a uniform it borrowed from training." The words were quiet, not cruel, but they landed hard. Elias lowered himself into a wooden chair at the kitchen table. Mara settled near May's feet, then placed the blue key beside a small metal box on the counter. The kitchen had yellow walls, chipped white cabinets, and a window facing the frozen lake. A row of mugs hung from hooks, most painted with flowers, one bearing the words, "World's Okayest Nurse." May caught Elias looking at it and said, "Gift from a man whose stitches I removed after he tried to fix a lawnmower while it was running. He survived. The lawnmower and common sense did not." Despite himself, Elias almost smiled. May prepared tea, or attempted to. She placed loose leaves into the pot, set out a plate, opened a drawer, closed it, opened another drawer, and muttered at a spoon as if it had betrayed her personally. Then, with great confidence, she poured hot water directly onto the tray beside the cups. The water spread in a steaming sheet. Mara lifted her head and stared at the mess with such solemn disappointment that Elias could not stop the small laugh that escaped him.
It was not loud. It was not whole. But it was real. May looked at the tray, then at him.
Don't get sentimental. I meant to do that. It tests the absorbency of wood. The laugh faded, but something in the room loosened. May wiped the tray with a dish towel, this time placed the cups properly and brought tea to the table. Her hands trembled slightly. Elias accepted a cup. He did not want tea. He held it anyway. Warmth mattered, even when a man was too stubborn to admit he needed it. May sat across from him with a folder on her lap. Clara told me if you ever came here, I wasn't to soften the truth so much it lost its bones. Sounds like her. It does. May's face changed at Clara's name. The humor remained, but grief moved beneath it like a fish under dark water. She was my friend for 26 years. She had a way of making a person feel recruited by kindness. You'd agree to help with one basket of soup and wake up 6 months later in charge of 3 widows, a church closet, and the dog who judged your posture. Mara thumped her tail once. May opened the folder. Inside were maps, schedules, and small cards marked with dates. After Clara got sick, I helped keep the project running. Not as well as she did. No one did anything as well as Clara did, which was inspiring when she was alive and, frankly, irritating now that she is gone. She slid a map toward him. Red pencil lines curved through Brindle Creek like veins. These were Mara's roots. Elias leaned over the map. He saw streets, houses, loops through town, paths to the church basement, the old station, the market, and finally Hemlock Ridge. His finger stopped near his own cabin. May saw the movement. Yes, she went to you. She came 7 nights before I let her in. May shook her head. No, Elias. You noticed her for 7 nights. She pulled another card from the folder and placed it in front of him. She came 43 times. The number struck the table harder than any accusation could have. Elias stared at it. 43. 43 evenings when Mara had climbed the ridge. 43 times she had sat somewhere in the snow, on the porch, near the gate, perhaps beyond the window where he could not see her. 43 times she had left because he had not opened the door. He felt shame rise hot under his coat. Why didn't anyone tell me? May's eyes sharpened. Would you have answered? He looked away. That is not a scolding, May said. It is a question with the manners to already know its answer. Mara had laid her head on her paws. Elias looked down at her. 43, he whispered. May folded her hands over the folder. Dogs do not count days the way we do. They do not measure dignity, inconvenience, or whether their love has been returned in a timely fashion. Dogs count by who is still worth going back for. The kitchen became very quiet. Outside, the frozen lake held the last light in a thin, metallic line. Elias thought of all the nights he had sat inside his cabin, believing himself abandoned, while love or duty or some 4-legged form of Clara's stubborn mercy had been waiting outside. The realization did not comfort him. Comfort would have been too easy. It disturbed him. It made his loneliness less pure, less defensible. He had not merely been alone. He had been refusing witnesses. May pulled a second folder from the chair beside her. Mara was never lost. Clara trained her here at the station, and in half the kitchens in this town. After Clara died, Mara stayed with me because Clara asked me to keep her work alive. May paused, lips pressing together. I tried, for a while. But bodies become unreliable governments. My knees staged a rebellion. Then my memory began misplacing afternoons. Some mornings I woke knowing exactly what needed doing. Other mornings I could not remember whether I had fed the dog or only dreamed I had. Mara learned the routes better than I did. Eventually she began making them without me.
Elias pictured it.
Mara walking alone through town, an aging German shepherd carrying Clara's unfinished mercy from doorstep to doorstep. People let her in. Some did, some didn't. Some only opened the door enough to say they didn't need help, then cried into her fur 10 minutes later. Humans are very committed to making things inefficient. He looked at the maps again. Why me last? May's expression softened, and that softness made him brace himself. Not last. Hardest. The word settled between them. Hardest. Elias wanted to reject it. He wanted to say he had managed. He had paid bills, kept the stove running, shoveled his steps, eaten enough to remain alive. But he understood now that survival could be a polished mask. A house with smoke rising from the chimney could still be a ruin inside.
May stood slowly and motioned toward the hall.
Come. There are records in the back room.
The back room had once been a sun porch. Now it held boxes, file cabinets, stacks of blankets, bags of dog food, walking canes, donated coats, and notebooks tied with ribbon. A narrow cot sat along one wall. On a shelf above it rested Clara's blue raincoat, folded carefully inside a clear garment bag. Elias stopped when he saw it. May noticed but did not comment. That restraint felt like kindness. She unlocked a gray file cabinet with the blue key Mara had brought, pulled open the bottom drawer, and removed a thick binder labeled Current Watch List in Clara's handwriting, though several later pages were written in May's shakier hand. These were the people Clara worried about most before she died, May said. Afterward, the list changed. Some moved away, some passed, some found family again, some still need someone to remember they exist. Elias opened the binder. Many names had been crossed out with notes beside them. Son returned, moved to assisted living, church group visits weekly, deceased, refuses all help but accepts dog, check in spring. Each line felt like a life reduced to a bridge between isolation and being seen. Then he turned a page and stopped. At the bottom, written in Clara's hand first and underlined later by May, was a name he knew better than his own. Grace Ward, Yellow House, Birch Hollow Road. His daughter. The room seemed too narrow. The coat and the garment bag, the folders, the blankets, the lake beyond the window, all of it blurred. Elias gripped the edge of the binder. Grace had not been merely someone he had failed to call. Clara had worried about her too, not as a child needing rescue, but as a woman standing outside a father's locked grief, slowly learning to stop knocking. Mara came to his side and pressed close, not touching his hand until he lowered it. May said nothing. The silence did what Clara would have done. It made room for the truth without letting him escape it. The next morning arrived without drama, only with a pale wash of light over Miller Lake and a cold that seemed to have learned patience from the stones. Elias Ward left May Whitcomb's white house carrying a folder beneath his arm, the blue key in his pocket, and a weight in his chest that had changed shape overnight. It was no longer only grief. Grief, he knew. Grief had sat with him for 3 years, taken coffee at his table, slept in Clara's chair, and walked beside him from room to room like a second shadow. This new weight was less familiar. It had names, addresses, notes written in Clara's careful hand. It had Grace's yellow house on Birch Hollow Road waiting at the bottom of a page like a verdict he was not ready to hear. Mara walked beside him through the snow, older than she had seemed when she first appeared at his door, not because her body had changed, but because Elias now understood how many roads she had carried inside her. Her sable coat caught silver in the morning light, her muzzle was touched with gray, and her brown eyes held the calm authority of one who had visited more lonely kitchens than most pastors. May had stood on the porch behind them, wrapped in her green cardigan, one hand on the rail, calling after him. "Do not start with Grace if you are only going to bleed on her doorstep." Elias had turned, annoyed. May had lifted her chin. "Start where Clara started. Learn how to enter a life without marching into it."
That was how Elias found himself following Mara down toward town instead of toward Birch Hollow Road, with Clara's watch list folded under his arm and the humbling suspicion that he had spent his whole life being brave in the wrong direction. Mara led him first to Elm Street, where small houses sat close together beneath bare maples, and every porch seemed to hold a shovel, a wreath, or a chair waiting for warmer weather. She stopped before a narrow gray cottage with lace curtains and a porch light that was not only out but cracked, the glass globe hanging at an angle like a tired eye. The steps had not been swept after the last snow. Mail leaned from the box in a damp fan. On Clara's list, the name beside the address was Dorothy Hale. Elias remembered her as a tiny woman who used to sell knitted mittens at the church bazaar and scold children for taking 2 cookies before dinner. He climbed the steps, uncertain how to begin. He had kicked down doors in another lifetime. Now he found himself intimidated by a polite knock. Mara sat beside the door. She did not bark. She did not scratch. Elias knocked once, softly, then felt ridiculous and knocked again. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the curtain shifted. The door opened 3 inches. Dorothy Hale peered out, smaller than Elias remembered, wrapped in a purple sweater too large for her narrow shoulders. She was 81, with white hair thin as dandelion fluff, pale blue eyes behind round glasses, and skin so delicate it seemed the cold might bruise it.
Yet her mouth was sharp.
"If you are selling something, I already own this appointment in several sizes." Elias blinked. "No, ma'am." Her gaze dropped to Mara. Her face changed before she could stop it. "Oh." The door opened wider. "Clara's dog." Elias felt the old ache at Clara's name. "You knew her?" "I knew enough to let the dog in before I let most people in." Dorothy stepped back. "Well, don't stand there making the cold feel important." The cottage smelled of peppermint, old books, and the faint sourness of laundry left too long in a basket. A small table held 1 place setting, 1 folded napkin, 1 bowl. Elias noticed because Mara noticed first. The German Shepherd walked not to Dorothy, but to the kitchen, where she stopped beside a chair with a cardigan draped over it and lowered her head toward the floor. Dorothy followed with surprising speed for a woman so slight. "Don't you start," she told the dog. "I only dropped it yesterday." Elias bent and picked up a prescription bottle that had rolled beneath the chair. Dorothy's face tightened. "My hands have been foolish lately." Elias set the bottle on the table. He could have asked whether she needed help. He nearly did. Then he remembered Clara's notes. "Do not make pride defend itself." He looked toward the porch. "Your light's out. I have an extra bulb in the truck." He did not have a truck with him. He had no bulb, but he could get one. Dorothy studied him, then Mara, then the mail. "It is a very arrogant light," she said. "Been refusing duty for a week." Elias nodded. "I'll come back this afternoon." Dorothy lifted her chin. "Bring a bulb." Not sympathy. Mara's tail swept once across the floor, as if marking the visit a success. Their second stop was behind the old mill road, where a low brown house leaned into a stand of pines, and wood smoke drifted weakly from a metal chimney. The mailbox hung open, packed with envelopes and circulars, but Mara walked past it to the side yard, where a stack of split logs stood half-covered by snow. Beside it, a hand axe lay abandoned. Elias saw the problem a second later. A smear of dried blood on the axe handle, dark against the wood. Not enough for panic, but enough for attention. The name on Clara's list was Samuel Pike. Retired carpenter, widower, bad hip, worse temper, accepts help only if convinced he is supervising. Elias knocked at the side door. A voice inside barked, "I'm not dead." "Good," Elias said. "That saves paperwork." The door opened. Samuel Pike was in his late 70s, broad through the chest, though his body had thickened with age, with bow-legged knees, a gray beard trimmed unevenly,
and bushy eyebrows that seemed to have declared independence from the rest of his face. His right hand was wrapped in a stained towel. His eyes were dark and suspicious, but not unkind. Men like Samuel often built walls because no one had taught them fences could have gates. He stared at Elias.
Ward?
Pike.
You here for a reason?
Mara stepped forward and sat by the woodpile. Samuel looked at her, and something in his face softened by a fraction.
That dog still making rounds? Looks that way.
Samuel grunted.
Clara used to bring her by. Pretended she needed advice on fixing shelves.
Woman could fix anything except her habit of lying politely.
Elias looked at the towel. You cut yourself.
I noticed.
Need stitches?
Need people to stop asking stupid questions. Mara lowered her head onto her paws and stared at Samuel's wrapped hand. The old carpenter lasted perhaps 7 seconds beneath that gaze.
Fine,
he snapped. It may need looking at. Elias drove him to Dr. Patel's clinic in town. Dr. Annika Patel was a lean woman in her 50s with warm brown skin, sharp black eyes, and silver streaks running through a braid that reached the middle of her back. She had moved to Brindle Creek 20 years earlier after leaving a large hospital in Burlington, claiming small towns had fewer committees and more interesting injuries. Her manner was calm, precise, and impossible to bully. She examined Samuel's hand while he complained about chairs, weather, needles, and civilization. 3 stitches, she said, and no axe for a week. Samuel looked offended.
A week?
Would you prefer 2? He shut his mouth. Elias, standing near the door with Mara at his side, experienced a small, dangerous flicker of amusement. Watching another stubborn old man lose an argument to a woman with steady eyes felt uncomfortably familiar. By midday, Elias had fixed Dorothy's porch light, cleared her steps, and placed her mail on the kitchen table without mentioning that half of it was overdue. Dorothy rewarded him with a tin of cookies, so hard they could have been issued as winter road equipment. "Good for the jaw," she said. Elias tried one out of courtesy and briefly saw several ancestors.
Mara sniffed the cookie, declined with dignity, and earned from Dorothy the highest praise available in New England. Sensible creature.
The third address took them to a yellow duplex near the edge of town, where plastic toys lay frozen in the snow beside a tipped laundry basket. The name on the list was Leah Moreno. Elias did not remember her. Mara did. The German Shepherd went straight to the back steps and paused by 2 bowls on the landing. One held untouched soup, a skin formed over the top. The other held crackers gone soft from the cold. Elias's stomach tightened. He knocked. From inside came a baby's thin cry, then the shuffle of feet. The door opened to a woman in her early 40s with olive skin, dark hair pulled into a messy bun, and tired brown eyes that seemed older than her face.
She was not elderly like Dorothy or Samuel, yet the exhaustion around her shoulders made her appear weathered by a private storm. She wore a faded sweatshirt, jeans, and one sock inside out. A toddler clung to her leg, serious and round-cheeked, holding a wooden spoon like a royal scepter. Leah looked at Elias, then at Mara, and shame crossed her face so quickly it might have been missed by someone less trained to notice pain.
"I'm sorry," she said, before anyone accused her of anything. "The bowls are from yesterday. I meant to bring them in."
"I didn't ask," Elias said, more gently than he expected.
Her eyes filled, but she blinked hard. "My son calls on Sundays. He forgot last week. Or maybe I forgot he called, I don't know. The days are strange lately." She laughed once, embarrassed. "I used to run a diner kitchen. Now I lose a spoon while holding it." Mara moved forward only after the toddler released Leah's leg and reached out. The German Shepherd lowered herself fully to the floor, chin down, making her large body small enough for a child to trust. The toddler patted Mara's head with sticky solemnity. Leah covered her mouth. That human sound, the one caught between a laugh and a sob, passed through the kitchen like a fragile bird. Elias saw then what Clara had seen. Loneliness did not always live in empty houses. Sometimes it lived in crowded rooms, beside toys and laundry and a phone that did not ring when it should. He did not know what to say. That was fortunate. Words would have ruined it. Instead, he asked whether the porch railing had always leaned that badly.
Leah looked toward it surprised.
It's been loose since November.
Elias nodded. I can tighten it. She began to protest. He added, Mara will supervise. Leah looked at the dog, then at the toddler now trying to show Mara the wooden spoon.
She looks strict.
Terrifying, Elias said. It was the first small joke he had made in someone else's kitchen in years. The day continued in pieces. A fixed railing, a checked mailbox, a quiet delivery of firewood to Samuel's back porch under the fiction that Elias had split too much, a promise to Dorothy that he would return with softer cookies for comparative analysis. Mara guided each stop with the same calm purpose. She paused at gates, sniffed thresholds, watched windows. She noticed what people trained themselves not to see. Curtains closed too long, a newspaper buried in snow, smoke absent from a chimney, a bowl left untouched by a back door. Elias followed, clumsy but learning. He learned not to open with, "Are you all right?" because nearly everyone lied to that question. He learned to offer work before comfort. He learned that sitting at a kitchen table could be harder than standing watch in bitter weather. Because at a table there were no ranks, no procedures, no clean lines between the helper and the helped. There were only two people, and whatever truth had walked in with them. Near sunset, he and Mara passed the community center where Grace worked 2 towns over on certain weekdays, though today her car was not there. Elias slowed anyway. The building's windows reflected a bruised pink sky. He imagined Grace inside some room with plastic chairs, listening to people speak honestly about hurt, while her own father had spent years making silence into a locked gate. He pictured her auburn hair falling loose from its knot, the crease between her brows when she was trying not to cry, the way she used to fold her arms when waiting for him to say something human. Clara had worried about Grace, not because Grace was weak, but because love can make even strong people stand too long in cold places. By the time Elias returned to Hemlock Ridge, night had settled over the trees. He fed Mara, and this time she ate, slowly and with approval that felt conditional. He built the fire, removed his boots, and placed Clara's folder on the table.
The cabin no longer felt empty in the same way.
It felt watched, not by ghosts, but by expectations. Dorothy's porch light now burned somewhere in town. Samuel's hand was stitched. Leah's railing would hold through the next storm. None of it was grand, none of it absolved him. But the day had placed small stones across a river he had believed uncrossable. Elias opened the folder to the page he had been avoiding. Grace Ward, Yellow House, Birch Hollow Road. He set his phone beside the paper. For a long while he stared at both. Mara stood near the front door, where everything had begun. She did not pace, she did not whine, she did not command him with a bark. She only waited, patient enough to make love feel like an inconvenience and mercy feel like a summons. Elias picked up the phone.
His thumb hovered over Grace's name.
Then he set it down. Mara's ears flicked, but she did not move. For the first time, Elias understood how infuriating it was to be loved by a creature who believed he was still worth returning to. Morning came to Hemlock Ridge with a thin, blue light and the quiet cruelty of unfinished things. Elias Ward had slept poorly, if what he had done could be called sleep. He had sat too long by the stove the night before, staring at Grace's name on Clara's list until the letters seemed to lift from the paper and hover in the warm air like a sentence waiting for a verdict. Grace Ward, Yellow House, Birch Hollow Road. He had picked up the phone twice and put it down twice. Mara had watched him from beside the door, patient enough to make silence feel like a sermon. By dawn,
The fire had burned low, his coffee had gone cold in the mug, and the old cabin seemed less like a shelter than a witness. Elias had once believed that a man could protect others by keeping his damage contained.
He had built walls around grief, the way soldiers once built barriers against wind and shrapnel. But the day before had shown him something he did not want to know. Walls did not only keep pain in, they kept love out. The thought made him restless, and restlessness in a man like Elias often became motion before it became honesty. Mara rose before he did. The German shepherd stood slowly, her older joints stiff from the previous day's rounds, then crossed to Clara's folder on the table and touched the edge with her nose. Her sable coat caught the morning light, dark along the spine, warm at the chest, gray at the muzzle, her brown eyes steady and unromantic. She had no interest in his excuses. Elias looked at the folder, then toward the window where snow dusted the pines.
"You're becoming very pushy for a creature trained to wait," he said.
Mara blinked once. The expression, if one could call it that, suggested she had waited 43 times and was therefore entitled to some professional impatience. Elias almost smiled, but the smile did not survive. His mind returned to Grace. He saw her as a girl with red mittens, waving from a school stage while he arrived late and stood in the back. He saw her as a young woman helping Clara plant marigolds, dirt on her cheek, pretending not to notice that he did not know how to ask about her life. He saw her after Clara's funeral, pale and rigid, holding a casserole dish as if it were a shield. The memories did not arrive in order. Pain rarely respects chronology. He did not drive to Birch Hollow Road, not yet. Instead, he took the blue key, the brass bell, and the folder, and went back to the old station. The decision was cowardice disguised as preparation, and he knew it. That made it no less necessary. Some men run from truth by moving away from it. Elias had a more disciplined method. He moved around it, mapping every surrounding hill before admitting the mountain was still there. Mara followed him down the ridge and through the waking town. Brindle Creek smelled of stove smoke, thawing salt, and bread from Avery's market. A few people waved. Elias nodded back, awkwardly, like a man relearning an extinct language. Dorothy Hale's porch light burned bright on Elm Street. The sight caught him off guard. It was only a bulb, nothing heroic, yet it glowed with embarrassing significance. Samuel Pike's chimney smoked stronger than before. Leah Moreno's repaired railing stood firm beneath a thin coat of frost. These small proofs of yesterday's work did not absolve him, but they argued quietly against the lie that nothing he did mattered. At the old station, the back room waited in its gray stillness. Elias had closed the door when he left, but not nailed it shut. That difference mattered. He entered with Mara beside him, and the dust rose again in the narrow shafts of winter light. The sign still hung on the wall, the Open Door Project. Beneath it, Clara's line remained visible, for the ones who stopped knocking, and the ones still waiting to be heard. Elias set the bell on the center table. Its cracked metal note had followed him through the night in memory, less a sound than a summons. Mara moved toward the file cabinet where Clara's records had been stored, then stopped in front of a low drawer Elias had not opened. She looked back. "Of course," he muttered. "Another secret." The drawer resisted at first. When it came loose, Elias found not file folders but a stack of cloth-bound notebooks tied with a blue ribbon. The top notebook was labeled in Clara's handwriting, "Final Route Notes." He stood there for several seconds before touching it. The words "final" and "Clara" did not belong together, though life had forced them into the same room years ago. He untied the ribbon carefully and opened the first notebook. The early pages contained ordinary notes, supply lists, names of volunteers, weather routes, reminders to buy more tea, instructions for cleaning Mara's paws after winter visits. Clara had drawn tiny stars beside people who accepted help without pretending to be irritated. She had drawn a small thundercloud beside Samuel Pike's name, then written, Approach with lumber-related excuse. Elias let out a quiet breath that almost became a laugh. Clara had always believed humor was not the opposite of sorrow, but a lantern one could carry through it. Then he turned to the later pages. The handwriting remained neat, but the spacing widened as if fatigue had begun taking more room on the page. Elias read slowly. Clara wrote of illness without self-pity, which was very like her and therefore almost unbearable. She wrote that her body was becoming an unreliable partner. She wrote that May would keep records if memory allowed. She wrote that Mara knew the routes better than anyone.
Then, halfway through the notebook, Elias found the passage that changed the shape of everything. If Elias ever opens the door, do not treat it as the end of Mara's work. It is only the beginning. I did not train Mara to rescue my husband from grief like some storybook miracle. Elias would hate that, and he would be right to hate it. A man is not a fallen chair to be set upright by a clever dog. I trained Mara to find the person who could continue the work when I could not. Elias will believe he is the one being saved. Let him believe it at first if he must. But the truth is this: he is not the final house. He is the first door. Elias stopped reading. The station seems to expand around him, the dust, the chairs, the blankets, the old maps all drawing back to make room for a truth larger than the room. He had thought Mara came because he was pitiful enough to require rescue. He had resented that, then softened toward it, then feared it. But Clara, clever, maddening Clara, had known him better. She had understood that Elias could not be healed by being made into an object of pity. He could not be coaxed back to life by being told he deserved comfort. Comfort alone would have made him retreat. Meaning might make him move. Responsibility might get through where tenderness could not. Clara had not left him a cure. She had left him a post to hold, a route to walk, a bell to carry, a dog to follow, and a town full of doors that needed someone strong enough to approach gently. Mara sat across from him, ears upright, her face calm. Elias looked at her and felt the absurd urge to salute. "So that's it," he said softly. "You weren't waiting for me to be found." Mara's tail moved once. "You were waiting for me to report for duty." The words should have sounded ridiculous. A retired SEAL receiving orders from a dead wife and a German shepherd in an abandoned railway station would not have inspired confidence in any official committee. Yet nothing in his life had felt more precise in years. He read on. Clara's notes became more personal. She wrote that Elias had spent his life moving toward danger for others and away from tenderness for himself. She wrote that strength, if left alone too long, could harden into a locked room. She wrote that the people on the list did not need rescuers with shining armor or perfect words. They needed someone who could notice a cold porch, an untouched bowl, an uncollected prescription, a joke told too quickly. They needed someone who would not be offended by refusal, someone who understood that not every closed door was rejection. Sometimes it was fear wearing a deadbolt. Then came Grace. Grace has come to the house more times than Elias knows, Clara had written. Soup in March, bread in April, blueberry jam in June because he always pretended not to like it and then ate half the jar. Old photographs in August, a cactus in September, which made me laugh so hard I had to sit down. She called it the emotional support plant for emotionally unavailable men. Elias covered his mouth with one hand. The laugh that came was small and wounded. He remembered the cactus now, or rather he remembered seeing something green on the porch one morning and assuming Lottie had left it as a joke. It had died in the corner of the woodshed because he had never brought it inside. Clara's next lines were harder. Grace is not staying away because she does not love him. She is staying away because love has weight, and she has carried her side of it to his door again and again. I worry she will learn to protect herself by becoming too much like him. Elias, if you read this someday, understand this clearly. Grief explains many things,
but it does not erase the footsteps of those left standing outside. Elias lowered himself into a folding chair. It squeaked beneath him, the same undignified protest as before. He would have welcomed the humor if he had room for it. Instead, he stared at the page until Clara's ink blurred. He had told himself Grace was ashamed of him. It had been a useful lie because it made her distance her choice. It allowed him to be wounded instead of responsible. But Clara's notebook stripped the lie down to its bones. Grace had tried. He had not known because he had not opened. He had not heard because he had trained himself to treat every knock as danger. His grief had not only made him lonely, it had made other people lonely in relation to him. That was a different kind of sorrow, one with no noble shape. Mara came closer, but did not touch him. Elias looked down at her. "You knew about her, didn't you?" Mara's eyes held his. Perhaps that was the human mistake, to ask animals questions as if their answers must fit inside words. Clara had taught Mara roots, doors, names, patience. Mara did not need to understand human guilt to understand waiting. She had seen Grace's scent on the porch. She had likely watched Grace stand there with soup cooling in her hands. She had carried the map of that waiting inside her body, step after step, season after season. Elias closed the notebook, then opened it again to the final page. Clara's last note was short. "Do not build a monument for me. Do not make speeches about kindness while leaving the next porch dark. Ring the bell only when a door is ready to remember sound. Walk with Mara. Start small. Take soup badly seasoned if you must. Repair what can be repaired. Sit with what cannot. And when you reach Grace, do not arrive as a hero. Arrive as the man who finally understands he made her wait." Elias sat until the light shifted. Outside, a freight wind moved along the abandoned tracks with a low, mournful sound. The station was no longer merely a secret room. It was an altar of unfinished work. He placed the notebook back in the drawer, but kept the final page folded in his memory. Then he lifted the brass bell. It felt different now, not like evidence, not like a relic, like a tool. By late afternoon, Elias drove for the first time toward Birch Hollow Road. Mara sat in the passenger seat of his old truck, looking out through the windshield as snowfields passed on either side. Elias had brushed the truck clean, checked the tires, started the engine, turned it off, then started it again. The kind of preparation a man performs when he is not preparing for weather at all. Birch Hollow Road curved past low farms and a stand of birch trees, pale as bones. The yellow house appeared near the end, small and neat, with white trim, a bare lilac bush by the steps, and a porch swing tied up for winter. Grace's car sat in the drive, a dark blue Subaru with road salt crusted along the doors. A porch light burned even though the sun had not fully set. Elias stopped the truck across the road. He did not get out. Through the front window he saw movement, a tall woman crossing the room, auburn hair loose over one shoulder, sleeves rolled to the elbow. Grace. Even at a distance, he recognized the angle of her shoulders, the careful efficiency in the way she moved, so much Clara and so much herself that the sight nearly broke him. She paused near the window, not seeing him, holding a mug in both hands. Her face was thinner than he remembered, lovely in a tired, guarded way. Pale skin marked by the same freckles she had hated as a teenager. She looked toward the road for a moment, and Elias felt his hand move toward the door handle. Then fear, old and fast, closed around his chest. What could he say? That he was sorry? The word was too small. That he had loved her all along? True, but insufficient. That grief had made him cruel by omission? Too sharp, perhaps, but closer. He sat there, a 69-year-old man who had faced storms, gunfire, loss, command, and death, defeated by the distance between a truck and a porch. Mara waited for 3 minutes. Then she jumped down when Elias opened the door only to breathe, crossed the road, and sat in front of Grace's gate.
not at the porch, not at the door, at the gate, where waiting began before knocking. Her posture was exactly the same as it had been at Elias's cabin, front paws together, ears upright, body still, gaze fixed ahead. Elias stepped out of the truck. Cold air struck his face. Grace's house glowed softly beyond the fence. Mara did not look back. This time, she did not need to. Elias understood. The one who had to wait now was not the dog. The next morning was cold enough to make every breath feel borrowed. But the sky above Birch Hollow Road had cleared into a pale blue that looked almost merciful. Elias Ward arrived before he could talk himself out of it. He had driven the old truck slowly, both hands on the wheel, Mara seated beside him like a judge with fur, her sable body steady despite the road's frozen ruts. He had rehearsed sentences during the whole drive and lost every one of them before reaching Grace's yellow house. The house stood small and careful behind a white fence, with bare lilac branches leaning over the walkway and a porch swing tied still for winter. In daylight, it looked less like a verdict and more like a place where someone had tried to build a life that did not wait forever for one man to knock. Grace's dark blue Subaru was in the driveway. Smoke rose from the chimney. A pair of muddy boots sat by the porch steps. Ordinary signs of life. Elias had spent years treating ordinary signs as things that happened elsewhere. Mara jumped down first. Her joints were slower after the long week, but her dignity remained untouched. She walked to the gate and sat exactly where she had sat the evening before, front paws together, ears raised, eyes on the door. Elias stepped out of the truck. The cold entered his coat, but fear had already beaten it there. He stood by the gate, one hand on the latch, and for a moment he was not a retired Navy SEAL, not a man with silver hair and a hard jaw and a history of command. He was simply a father outside his daughter's house, carrying too many years in both hands and no idea where to put them. Mara did not look back. She had done her part. The next step belonged to him. Elias opened the gate. Its hinge complained softly, a small domestic sound that seemed louder than it should have been. He walked up the path. The porch boards creaked beneath his boots. He lifted his hand and almost stopped there, suspended between cowardice and love. Then he knocked. Inside, movement paused. Footsteps crossed the room. The door opened. Grace Ward stood before him in a thick gray sweater and jeans, one hand still on the knob, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders instead of tied back. She was 43, tall and lean, with Clara's gray-green eyes and Elias's strong chin softened by her mother's mouth. Her pale skin was marked by freckles across the nose, and there were tired shadows under her eyes that had not been there the last time Elias allowed himself to look at her closely. Grace had always had a way of standing still that did not seem passive. Even as a child, she could make silence feel like a question. Now her silence held years. It held funerals, unanswered calls, soup gone cold on a porch, a cactus left to die in a woodshed, and every word both of them had swallowed because pride often dresses itself as pain. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Mara sat behind Elias at the edge of the steps, not intruding, not retreating. Grace's eyes moved to the German shepherd and recognition flickered. "Clara's dog," she said quietly. Elias nodded. His throat worked. The apology he had planned was gone. The speech about grief and confusion and not knowing how to be a father without Clara had collapsed under the weight of Grace's face. In the end, what came out was smaller and truer. "I left you outside too long." Grace's mouth tightened. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry at first. She looked away toward the yard, toward the road, toward every place easier than her father's face. "You did," she said. There was no softness in it, no immediate forgiveness. Elias felt the words strike where they needed to. He nodded once. "I know."
I came after Mom died. Her voice shook, then steadied. Grace had spent years helping other people say hard things, and perhaps that training was the only reason the door did not close. I came with food, with pictures, with things I thought might make the house feel less empty. You never answered. I know now. You didn't then. No. Her eyes came back to him. Anger lived there, but under it was exhaustion, and under that, love so tired it had almost forgotten its own name. Do you know what the worst part was? She asked. I kept making excuses for you. He's grieving, he's old, he doesn't know how to talk, he thinks silence is safer. I gave you reasons until I ran out of room for myself. Elias took that in without defending himself. It was harder than he expected. Men like him could stand punishment more easily than truth, because punishment ended. Truth moved in and rearranged the furniture. I'm sorry, he said. The words felt inadequate, but he refused to dress them up. I don't expect that to fix anything. It doesn't. I know. Mara rose then and climbed one step, not toward Grace's hand, but toward the threshold. She stopped there, halfway between them. Grace looked down at her. A faint, broken laugh escaped her. She always did know where to stand. Elias looked at the dog, then at his daughter. Your mother trained her better than she trained me. Grace's expression shifted before she could prevent it. Not forgiveness, something smaller, a crack in the ice where water might remember how to move. Mom had more patience with dogs, she said. Dogs listened. That's not fair. I occasionally listened after the third warning. Despite herself, Grace gave a short laugh, then covered her mouth as if the sound had betrayed her. The laugh turned into tears. She stepped back from the door. Come in before I change my mind. Elias crossed the threshold without victory. That mattered. He did not enter as a rescued man, a hero, or a father restored by one brave sentence. He entered like a man permitted into a room he had once abandoned, knowing permission was not the same as absolution. Grace's house smelled of coffee, cedar, and cinnamon toast. On the wall near the kitchen hung photographs. Grace with Clara at a fall fair. Grace beside a group of teenagers at the community center. Grace alone on a hiking trail, smiling in a way that looked practiced but not false. Elias noticed there were no recent photographs of him. The absence hurt, but he did not resent it. Absence was something he had built. They drank coffee at the kitchen table. Grace's kitchen was clean but lived in, with a stack of counseling books near the window, a chipped mug holding pens, and a half-dead basil plant on the sill. She saw him looking at it and said, I'm better with people than herbs. I killed the cactus. I know. He looked up. Grace stirred her coffee. Lottie told me. She said it died bravely under emotionally difficult conditions. Elias closed his eyes for 1 second. That woman is a menace. She's been checking on me since Mom died. I'm glad. Grace looked at him carefully, perhaps expecting jealousy or embarrassment. When neither came, something in her shoulders lowered. They did not solve the years that morning. They did not hug while sunlight poured over them like a blessing in a painting. Grace cried twice. Elias apologized without explaining away the hurt. Mara slept under the table, one paw touching both of their feet at different moments, as if performing quiet diplomacy between two nations that shared a border and a history of regrettable weather. When Elias left, Grace did not promise Sunday dinners or daily calls. She stood on the porch with her arms folded against the cold and said, You can call tomorrow, not tonight. Tomorrow. Elias nodded. Tomorrow. And if I don't answer, you don't get to disappear for 3 years. No. Mara looked at him sharply as if taking minutes for the meeting. Grace noticed and pointed at the dog. She's holding you accountable. She's been doing that professionally. Grace reached down and touched Mara's head.
The German shepherd accepted the gesture with grave approval.
Good, Grace said. Somebody had to. Spring did not arrive all at once in Brindle Creek. It came in drips from porch roofs, in mud along the road shoulders, in the first brave weeds pushing through snowbanks like tiny green rebels. The Open Door Project returned the same way, not as a grand announcement, not with speeches, banners, or a newspaper photograph that would have made everyone stand awkwardly with their hands visible. It returned through small acts. Elias repaired the old station room with Samuel Pike supervising loudly from a chair despite doctor's orders to rest his hand and his opinions. Dorothy Hale donated peppermint tea and cookies that remained dangerously structural. Leah Moreno brought a box of children's books and stayed longer than she intended because Mara fell asleep on her shoe. Mrs. Avery sent soup from the market and insisted it was not charity because she had overcooked it on purpose. Dr. Annika Patel quietly left a first aid kit by the door. Lottie Bell organized address cards with the terrifying efficiency of a woman who believed the postal system was merely the lower branch of Providence. May Whitcomb came on the first Saturday the station opened again, carried in by stubbornness and a neighbor's sedan. She wore her green cardigan and a hat with a crooked feather, claiming the feather helped her remember she was not dead yet. When Elias tried to help her into a chair, she waved him off. "I am old, not decorative." Then she looked around the room. The folded blankets, the cleaned chairs, the polished brass bell Clara had once marked with her initials. May's eyes filled, but she blinked the tears back with military discipline that would have impressed Elias if he had been foolish enough to comment. "She would approve," May said, "though she would move that table 3 inches to the left and pretend it was obvious." Elias moved the table 3 inches. No one laughed harder than Grace, who had come with coffee and no promise to stay. She stayed anyway. Weeks passed. The project remained modest because modest things often last longer than dramatic ones. Once a week, Elias and Mara walked the old routes. Sometimes Grace came, sometimes she did not. Sometimes their phone calls were brief and clumsy. Sometimes old silence rose between them, familiar as an unwanted relative. But now Elias learned to say, "I don't know what to say, but I'm still here." Grace learned, slowly, to believe him for that day, and then another. They had dinner twice. The first meal was too polite. The second ended with Grace laughing when Elias burned the rolls and blamed enemy activity in the oven. Forgiveness did not fall from the sky. It grew like spring in Vermont, muddy, late, uneven, and miraculous only to those who knew how long the ground had been frozen. Mara aged through those weeks with quiet nobility. Her steps slowed. Her naps lengthened. Sometimes she paused halfway up a porch and waited for Elias to notice she needed a moment. He always did. Yet her eyes kept their ancient fire, the small temple flame that Clara must have trusted from the beginning. Mara still knew which doors needed waiting and which needed a single soft bark. She still placed her head on a knee only after permission. She still led Elias toward mailboxes too full, curtains too still, and people who said they were fine in voices that sounded like locked rooms. No one called her a hero in her presence. It would have embarrassed the humans and bored the dog. One evening in early spring, after the last snow had retreated into gray patches beneath the pines, Elias sat on his cabin porch with Mara at his feet. The repaired station glowed faintly in the distance, its windows lit for the first meeting of the season. Clara's small brass bell hung beside Elias's front door now, polished but not made new. Its tarnish remained in the grooves because some marks deserved to stay. A light wind moved across Hemlock Ridge, and the bell gave a soft, cracked note. Elias looks down at Mara. The German shepherd's muzzle had gone whiter. Her body rested heavily, but her eyes lifted to his with the same patient certainty she had carried through 43 unanswered visits. He thought of Clara, of Grace, of May, of all the dark windows that were not as dark as they had once been. "She knew, didn't she?" he asked. Mara placed her head on his boot. No voice answered from the trees. No miracle opened the sky. But in that quiet,
Elias understood something he had missed for years. There are things human beings cannot see when grief blinds them, and sometimes love must borrow 4 paws, a waiting heart, and an old brass bell to find the way home.
Maybe the miracle in this story was not that a German shepherd found the right door. Maybe the miracle was that God can still reach a locked heart through the quietest messenger. Elias thought he was protecting himself by staying closed, but pain does not stay inside one room. It touches daughters, neighbors, friends, and even strangers who keep hoping we will come back to them. Mara reminds us that love does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it waits on the porch. Sometimes it comes through a phone call we avoid, a neighbor who notices, or a small chance to repair what we once left broken. In everyday life, healing often begins when we stop asking, "Who will rescue me?" and start asking, "Whose door can I gently knock on today?" If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need a little hope tonight. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe for more stories of faith, healing, and the quiet mercy that still finds its way home. May God bless you, protect your family, and bring light to every door you are afraid to open.